Russia Area of Study 1, 1986 to 1917. Before we begin, let's recognize that this area of study can be divided into three revolutions. The 1905 Revolution, aka the establishment of a constitutional monarchy, the February 1917 Revolution, which established the end of the Tsarist regime, and the Socialist Revolution in October 1917. Before we begin, let's introduce the key people of the story. First are the people who are for autocracy and are affiliated with the Romanovs. First is Tsar Nicholas II, the Tsar of Russia from 1986 till his abdication in 1917. He had 5 children, 4 daughters, and 1 son, Alexei, who was a hemophiliac. His wife was Tsarina Alexandra, who was the Grand Duchess of the German Empire and the granddaughter of Queen Victoria of the UK. Next are the Russian finance ministers, Sergei Witte and Pyotr Stolypin. Sergei Witte implemented industrial reforms, whereas Stolypin implemented agrarian reforms. Grigory Rasputin, who was Russia's infamous mad monk. He was a mystic and a quote-unquote holy man. Now for the ops. First was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, mostly known as Lenin, who was a part of the Social Democrats and became the leader of the Bolshevik Party when the SD split in 1903. He was a believer in Marxism. Then there are Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin, who are both Bolshevik leaders. And finally there is Alexander Kerensky, who was part of the Socialist Revolutionaries, and later led the provisional government in the October Revolution. So what was life like in Russia at the time? Firstly, Russia was an autocratic country, meaning the Tsar had absolute power. The Tsar was descended from the Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for 3 centuries. Tsar Nicholas II became Tsar in 1896, although his crowning happened so suddenly after his father, Alexander II, died. Nicholas was only 26 years old and was not viable to rule. Be more autocratic than Peter the Great and sterner than Ivan the Terrible, Tsarina Alexandra. I'll preserve the principle of autocracy as firmly and unflinchingly as my late father, Nicholas II. What is going to happen to me in all of Russia? I am not prepared to be a Tsar. I never wanted to become one. I know nothing of the business of ruling, Nicholas II. Tsarism was upheld by 4 pillars. The government, which was comprised of the Imperial Council, the Cabinet of Ministers, and the Senate. The bureaucracy, which was the civil service. Russian Orthodox Church, which legitimized the Tsar and compared him to God. And the police. There was the Okhrana, which was the secret police of the Tsar, and the Cossacks, which suppressed the masses. To oppose Tsarism, there were revolutionary groups and ideologies. There were the revolutionaries, or the extremists, that believed Russia could not progress unless Tsarism was destroyed. The main 2 were the Socialist Revolutionaries and the Socialist Democrats, which we'll cover later on. And then there were the Reformers, aka the Liberals, who were strong critics of the Tsarist regime, but believed it could be changed for the better by reform from within. And this was the Cadets and the Octoberists, which we'll cover later on. The Socialist Revolutionaries, which was first established in 1979. It emerged from the populist movement called the Narodniks. Their leader was Viktor Chernov, and they were inspired by the misery of the peasants. They wanted a federal government instead of the Tsar, and argued that workers and peasants were the same and should work together to bring down autocracy. They talked of land socialization, meaning the redistribution of land to the peasants. The Social Democrats, which were established in 1989, they believed in Marxism, which is an ideology developed by Karl Marx. Marx saw society evolving through stages. Marx predicted that class conflicts between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat would lead to capitalism's downfall and a communist revolution. The SDs wanted to achieve revolution following Marx's ideas and scientific principles, and they believed in the dictatorship of the proletariat. They thought that violence and bloody affair against their enemies and all conflict would end in a harmonious society which would emerge from it. Although the SD split in 1903 into the Mensheviks, the minority, and the Bolsheviks, the majority. Lenin was the leader of the Bolsheviks. who were strong, ideologically pure, and disciplined, and their membership was only made of professional revolutionaries. They had total dedication to revolution, but did not believe in all stages of Marxism. They believed they could jump straight to the socialist stage. P.S. The Bolsheviks weren't actually that influential prior to the October Revolution because Lenin spent his time exiled in Siberia. Their methods were using newspapers, which Lenin created, called the Pravda, meaning truth, and Iskra, spark, which criticized the Mensheviks. They also had training schools for revolutionaries, which taught them to infiltrate trade unions and other organizations to stir up the workers. They also implemented terrorist attacks and bank robberies, example post offices to get funds. The Mensheviks were led by Martov, which was made of the mass of the working class and was open to all revolutionaries. They cooperated with other liberal parties and revolutionary parties. They believed that all stages of Marxism must occur, from the bourgeoisie to the proletariat. Then the liberal parties, which split when the constitutional monarchy was established in 1905. First were the Cadets, aka the Constitutional Democrat Party, which is the largest liberal party and wanted constricted powers of the Tsar. Then there was the Octoberists, specifically made to accept the October Manifesto in 1905. They were loyal to the Tsar and accepted the Dumas. However, they were disappointed by the limited power given to the Duma and became increasingly more critical. I'll cover the Dumas later on. Ruling Russia was no easy task. Russia is a vast country that crosses 2 continents, 11 time zones, and 5 vegetation zones. Ruling and elite classes lived in the European side, in major cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg. The population is the largest in Europe, and privilege was based on birth, not utility and merit. The social classes can be divided into 5 sectors. The ruling class, which included the Tsar, the court, and the government, which made up 0.5% of the populace. The upper class, the nobility, the clergy, and the military, which made up 12%. The commercial class of merchants, entrepreneurs, and financiers, 1.5%. The working class, 4%. And the peasants, which made up 82% of the populace. By the way, the industrial working class is known to be the proletariat, and the middle class is known as the bourgeoisie. Part 1. The 1905 Revolution. The Constitutional Monarchy. The events of 1905 were a prologue to the 2 revolutions of 1917, that of February and that of October, Trotsky. Since Russia's social classes were so disproportionate, causing a lack of economic progression, and Russia had an agricultural society compared to enterprising industrial countries like Germany, United States, and Britain, the finance minister Sergei White made reforms to address this issue. Sergei White was a prominent statesman and finance minister in the late Imperial Russia, and implemented significant industrial reforms from 1892 to 1903. These reforms included the establishment of the Trans-Siberian Railway. White prioritized the expansion of Russia's railway network. He believed that a well-developed railway system was crucial for economic growth as it would facilitate the transportation of goods and people across the vast empire. Foreign investments. White recognized the importance of foreign capital in developing Russia's industry. He actively encouraged foreign investment by offering incentives such as tax breaks and subsidies to foreign investors. This helped attract much-needed capital and expertise to Russia's industrial sector. Tariffs. White implemented a protective tariff policy to shield domestic industries from foreign competition. While this policy aimed to promote domestic industrial growth, it also led to higher prices for consumers and limited access to foreign markets for Russian goods. The gold standard. White introduced several financial reforms to stabilize Russia's economy and attract investment. He implemented the gold standard, which tied the Russian ruble to gold, ensuring a stable currency. He also reorganized the state banking system to improve efficiency and promote investment. Witt introduced regulations to improve labor conditions and productivity in Russian industries. He established labor laws that limited working hours and improved safety standards, although these measures were not effectively enforced. Witt's industrial reforms played a significant role in modernizing Russia's economy and laying the foundation for its industrial growth. However, they had some negative consequences, such as increasing social inequality and exacerbating tensions between the industrial working class and the ruling elite class. Russia went to war with Japan in 1904 to 1905. It was triggered by Nicholas II for his wish to expand the Russian Empire into Asia. The Tsar entered the war overconfident and haughty. He considered Japan an easy foe and underestimated the Japanese and their industrial and military development, which had outstripped Russia's own. In this war, it showed the failures and the incompetence of the Russian Baltic Fleet, also known as the Second Pacific Squadron.
For example, they got so paranoid about Japanese torpedo boats that it sunk a British trawler in the North Sea, some 30,000 kilometers from Japan, believing it to be a Japanese warship. In the confusion, the Russians also started shooting at each other. They shot at a German trawler and a Swedish merchant ship, not actually hitting them, and filling the ships with dangerous exotic animals from Madagascar, as they thought them to be souvenirs. When they finally sighted a Japanese ship, they mistook it for a Russian vessel and blew their cover.
The biggest Russian losses in the Russo-Japanese War were the Battle of Mukden, February to March 1905, which was a land battle, the largest before World War I, led by General Kuropatkin, and there were 90,000 casualties. Then there was the Battle of Tsushima in March 1905, known as the Voyage of the Damned, which was a sea battle and was the final battle of the war. The Second Pacific Squadron was led by General Rodhesvensky against Togohe Hachiro. The Russians traveled an 18-mile, 33-kilometer journey, which lasted 7 months, only to be beaten in 90 minutes. They lost all 11 ships and 6,000 soldiers were captured. The war finally ended, however, with the Treaty of Portsmouth on the 5th of September 1905. After the war, there were sailor mutinies. In the Battle of Potemkin, July, the Navy crew rebelled against their officers. And there were more mutinies in September. Army troops took control of a section of the Trans-Siberian Railway. While Russia was at war, back in St. Petersburg, there was a peaceful petition made by Father Kapan, signed by 135,000 workers, outlining their grievances and requesting reforms. It was triggered by 5 men being dismissed in the Putilov Steelworks strike on January 3rd. 111,000 people marched to the Tsar's Winter Palace, but the Tsar was not to be found. Instead, they were met by the Cossacks. This event is known as Bloody Sunday, January 22nd, 1905. 800 were wounded and 200 were dead. The Tsar was not there to consider their petition, and they were met with violence. Cossacks galloped rapidly towards us, men, women, and children dropping to the earth like logs of wood. Father Kapan. Due to all the bloodshed in Russia, the war, Bloody Sunday, strikes, and rebellions, a constitutional monarchy was granted, the Tsar establishing an elected parliament for the people called Duma, under the influence of Sergei Witt, and written in the October Manifesto document. When this was made, the liberals split into the cadets and the Octoberists, spoken about before in the video. All over Russia, they cried and begged for it. Nicholas. A constitution is given, but autocracy remains. Everything is given, and nothing is given. Trotsky. Although with a few broken ribs, Tsarism came out of the experience of 1905 alive and strong enough. Trotsky. Before opening the First Duma, Nicholas established the fundamental state laws in 1906, which reasserted the Tsar's autocracy and removed the sharing power offered in the October Manifesto. Part 2, the February Revolution, 1917. In 1906, a new finance minister replaced Sergei Witt, which was Pyotr Stolypin, who implemented agrarian reforms. He focused on strengthening the position of the Tsar and created the kulaks, aka the wealthy peasant class. He increased the value of the peasants' land holdings, eliminated communal village styles such as the Mir, and offered peasants affordable lines of credit for private land ownership. Ultimately, the reforms were intended to create farmers interested in making profit. He also shortened working days and banned nighttime and underground labor for women, teenagers, and children. I must face revolution, resist it, and stop it. Stolypin. As a result, the oppositions were weakened, and Stolypin reinforced Stolypin's necktie, his nickname for the hangman's noose, which became infamous as a method of fear and oppression. However, revolutionary groups survived underground and continued to attract support. At this time as well, in 1905 to 1906, a mystic traveler known as Grigory Rasputin arrived in St. Petersburg and captivated a number of religious and social leaders, eventually becoming a prominent figure in Russian society. In November 1905, Rasputin met Nicholas II and Alexandra. In late 1906, Rasputin began acting as a faith healer for Nicholas and Alexandra's only son Alexei, who suffered from hemophilia. The Dumas. There were 4 Dumas. The first Duma was in 1906, known as the People's Anger. It consisted mainly of cadets and SRs. It demanded further political reform, including land reform and the release of political prisoners. But this was denied by the Tsar. It lasted just over 2 months. The second Duma was in 1907. The cadets were involved in writing the Vyborg Appeal, which criticized the government and demanded the non-payment of taxes. In response, these cadets were made ineligible to vote and greatly reduced the power of the cadets. The liberal Octoberists, who agreed with the October Manifesto, had more influence than the SRs, Bolsheviks, and the Mensheviks, and this Duma lasted for 5 months. It was dissolved when members began promoting revolutionary organizations within the army. The third Duma in 1907 to 1912, which was the only Duma that served the 5 years. This Duma was intended to be much more supportive of the Tsar. Arrangements had been made for landowners to have more voting power. This meant only the most affluent third of the population were able to vote in the election. The resulting Duma was less radical and more favorable to the government. Pyotr Stolypin was able to pass considerable land reform, and it lasted from 1907 to 1912. Finally, the fourth Duma in 1912 was comprised of Octoberists on one side and Socialists on the other. This made decision-making difficult. Both groups found it impossible to unite in order to make progress. The Duma was suspended in 1915. By time, Russia was committed to fighting the Austrians and Germans in World War I. Curse the Duma, it's all its fault. Nicholas II. The Lena Goldfields Massacre in 1912. The Lena Goldfields Massacre was the killing of goldfield workers who were on strike for bad working conditions and fed raw and horse meat. 200 gold miners killed by police in Siberia. This event revived the opposition.
World War I, 1914 to 1915. World War I occurred because Germany wanted to challenge Britain's world supremacy. Austria wanted to restrict Serbia's expansion. Russia sided with Serbia and Germany with Austria. It began because of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, the Austrian Duke, on the 28th of June, 1914. Russia refused the ultimatum to surrender, so Germany declared war on the 1st of August, 1914. At first, the public's response was that they supported the war, and it repaired the division with the people and the Tsar. They held up placards with "Long Live Russia" on them, and also the name of St. Petersburg changed to Petrograd because it sounded too German. The military. There was the Battle of Tannenberg in August 1914, where there were 100,000 Russian prisoners of war, and the Battle of Masurian Lakes in September 1914, where they lost more than 4 million men. Nicholas then became commander of the Russian army in August 1915. The military lacked ammunition and rifles. They went into the trenches unarmed, and they had about 3 bullets per day. They also had poor internal organization, and their transportation was poor, and the troops went hungry. thus creating demoralized soldiers who were mostly comprised of conscripted peasants and workers. Most of Russia's finances were also spent on the war, so it increased the conditions back home. His loyalty to his allies remained unshaken. His failure to the loyalty of his own people cost him his throne. Lockhart. Economic consequences. Back home there were food and fuel shortages. The wages rose to 50%, 12 rubles went to 3. There was depression and tension in society, and many people became anti-war. People also wanted to stop conscription. In fact, women laid on those Trans-Siberian railway tracks to stop the troops from going. The financial and economic consequences of defeat will spell the total disintegration of our entire national economy. Durnovo, the minister who was warning Nicholas. Social consequences. Since Nicholas was in the war now in 1915, Alexandra was left in charge of the government and was accompanied by Rasputin. The Russian people were skeptical of the pair and conspired that Alexandra was pro-German since she is of German descent and called her a German spy. She was also quite politically inexperienced, and Rasputin influenced the selection of 4 prime ministers, foreign secretaries, 3 ministers of war, and 6 interior ministers. Socialist propaganda was also resurfacing at this time, and Rasputin was assassinated in 1916. All I want is to sleep forever on your shoulder, in your embrace, Serena to Rasputin. The Russian ministers were selected by an ignorant, blind, hysterical woman on the test of her subservience to an ignorant, fanatical, debauched adventurer, Sir B. Pears. The February Revolution of 1917. In February, there were 8 days of pure hell. On the 18th, Putilov steelworkers were locked out by their managers over pay and the workers striked. But there was no response from the Tsar from this. On the 23rd, on International Women's Day, 90,000 women protested in Petrograd because of food. On the 24th, 200,000 workers were on strike. And on the 25th, it grew to 240,000 workers. Public transport was stopped, and the newspaper closed. On the 26th, soldiers joined protesters. And on the 27th, workers controlled the entire city of Petrograd, except for the Winter Palace. Protesters released 15,000 political prisoners and ordinary criminals. Prisons, stations, government records were burned in bonfires. On the 28th, it was extreme violence. And on the 1st of March, soldiers, including the Imperial Guard and Cossacks, open marched in official formation wearing red ribbons, red flags, allegiance to revolution. Finally, on the 2nd of March, the Tsar's train was halted by the capture of train tracks, and that day the Tsar abdicated. When he abdicated, the power was transferred to the provisional government. These days pass like a nightmare, no beginning, no end, all jumbled together, conservative Duma member. All around me there is treachery, cowardice, and deceit. Nicholas II. If it is necessary to choose between the Tsar and Russia, I side with Russia. General Brusilov. Part 3. The Bolshevik/Socialist Revolution. After Tsarism ended, there was dual authority between the Petrograd Soviet and the Provisional Government. The Provisional Government had authority but no power. It was comprised of ex-Duma members and conservatives, and they wanted to continue fighting in World War I. They also postponed land reforms. Whereas the Petrograd Soviet had power but no authority, it was comprised of soldiers, workers, and radicalists, and the executive committee, Mensheviks, and the SRs. In April, Lenin returned from Finland by German train. He was actually sent by Germany to cause more problems in Russia. He presented his April thesis promising land, peace, and bread. He called for the Soviets to seize state power, as seen in his slogan, "All power to the Soviets." He denounced liberals and social revolutionaries in the provisional government and called for Bolsheviks not to cooperate with the government and called for new communist policies. In March, the Soviet Order No. 1 was instigated, decisions through the government having to be accepted by the Petrograd Soviet. It also abolished honorific titles. The currency offensive lasted 3 days. It was an expedition of the Russian army in World War I to fight the Germans. There were 400,000 casualties and 200,000 deserters. The cost of living went up to 70%, and the Soviet Order No. 1 limited the army's compliance to their generals. The July days, the 16th to the 20th. Kerensky became the prime minister of the provisional government, and Trotsky joined the Bolshevik Party. There were demonstrations of workers and soldiers in support of the Bolsheviks in Petrograd, where there was violence and rioting in the streets. There were about 100,000 to 500,000 people. Kerensky called the troops to open fire. Lenin fled to Finland again, and other Bolshevik leaders wanted to distance themselves. But since the crowd marched under Bolshevik slogans, Trotsky and 40,000 of his Red Army was imprisoned. The Kornilov Revolt. Kerensky ended up promoting General Kornilov as supreme commander, who is very anti-socialist, but he ended up using his dictatorship to gather troops and financial support to plan a coup against the Bolsheviks, and basically turned against the provisional government itself. Kornilov supposedly conspiring to abolish Kerensky's leadership. Kerensky knew he effed off from this, so he released Trotsky and the Red Armies out of prison, and they successfully suppressed Kornilov and his men. Now Kerensky was hated by both sides of the political divide. Followers of Kornilov considered him a traitor, and then the left wing believed Kerensky had been in league with Kornilov, at least initially. It is time to put an end to all this. It is time to hang the German spies led by Lenin, to break up the Soviet and to break it in such a way that it will never meet again, anywhere. Kornilov's letter to Kerensky. Everything was ready at headquarters and the front for the removal of Kerensky, ex-Duma member. This ended with Kornilov in prison. Now Bolshevik popularity skyrocketed because of the prior events. They were elected to the Petrograd and Moscow Soviets. In October, Trotsky became chairman, and Lenin returned from Finland and planned their takeover. In November, the Bolsheviks took over key buildings in the city, and Kerensky escaped. Finally, they stormed a Winter Palace and arrested the provisional government. Once they got power, they signed the peace treaty with Germany, called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, to end their participation in the war.